Let's take a look at some of the MIDI functions found under the MIDI menu. Let's start with Merge MIDI in Loop. This basically takes all the MIDI parts that are within the left and right locators or the cycle and combines them and merges down all of the MIDI data in the inspector window. Tracks that are muted will not be affected. The MIDI data that it merges includes MIDI modifiers, the MIDI inserts, and the MIDI sends. A dialog box pops up asking if you want to include the inserts and the sends. You can also choose to erase the destination. If you check Erase Destination, then any MIDI parts on the destination track will be deleted. The destination track is the selected track. If you don't check this, the merged MIDI part will be placed on top of the original part. You can then move it to another track or use it somewhere else. You can also choose to include Chase, which makes sure that the MIDI data that is just outside of the left and right locators is included. Dissolve part is great for when you have a MIDI part in your project that has multiple MIDI channels in it, such as an imported MIDI file. This separates all the channels into their own MIDI parts. You can also use this to separate a drum track into individual pitches like kick, snare, hi-hat, and so on. Optimize Display automatically removes the silent or empty areas of the resulting MIDI parts, essentially cutting it up for you. You can see here, not only are the note pitches divided into different tracks, but the space around the notes has been reduced for better viewing of the data. Let's do this again using Dissolve to sublanes. See how this turns on lanes for the MIDI track and separates the MIDI data into lanes? Legato, which can be found under Functions, extends each note to the next note. Fixed Lengths lets you resize all of your notes to a specific length that can be set using the quantize settings here. Delete Doubles deletes any notes that are on the same pitch and are in the exact same position. See how all the information in the info line is white? When there are multiple notes selected, the info line goes yellow. There's a double note here you can tell because when I selected it, everything went yellow. Let's choose Delete Doubles and check it. Now the double is gone. Delete Controllers removes any MIDI data controller information from a MIDI part. Delete Continuous Controllers is like Delete Controllers, but it doesn't delete on-off controls like sustain pedal events. Delete Notes allows you to delete MIDI events that are too short or aren't loud enough. Just set the minimums here and decide whether you want to delete the notes that fall under both, or one, or the other. Restrict Polyphony opens up a dialog that allows you to decide how many voices can play at a time. If you have an instrument that has limited voices, this makes sure that all of the notes are heard. Cubase does this by shortening the notes where necessary, so they end before the next note starts. Pedals to Note Length scans your MIDI part for sustain on-off events and then lengthens the affected MIDI notes to match the sustain pedal movements. The sustain controller information is then removed. For some unknown reason, I think this feature is really cool. Delete Overlaps Mono makes sure that no two notes of the same pitch overlap. Delete Overlaps Poly makes sure that no two notes overlap regardless of pitch. Velocity allows us to add or subtract velocity note values. You can also compress or expand the MIDI velocities or even limit them. Fixed velocity sets all the velocities to the value entered in the insert velocity display. Let's change this to something higher. Reverse inverts the order of the MIDI notes, playing it backwards. Thin out data lets you thin out dense controller data to ease the load on your MIDI devices. Extract MIDI automation is something you'll use all of the time. It will create MIDI automation from controller data in your MIDI part and create automation tracks underneath. That's crazy. Let's finish up by looking at merge tempo from tapping. If you have a freely recorded audio or MIDI part and you want to match the project tempo to it, you can tap the tempo in by creating MIDI notes. Then select the recorded MIDI part and then select Merge Tempo from tapping. Tempo information gets written in the tempo track and then Cubase will follow your music. We have a MIDI part here that is not in time with Cubase. The first thing we need to do is change the time base of this track to linear. This makes sure that the new tempo information doesn't influence it. Let's record a makeshift click track below it. Now select Merge Tempo from tapping. Select the resolution you tapped in at the drop-down here. Now check Begin at bar start, so Cubase begins inserting its tempo at the beginning of the bar. Now we have our MIDI track all lined up. As you can see, you can do some pretty cool things with MIDI functions.